The galaxy has always viewed Earth as a backward, primitive death world. A place where only the hardiest of life could survive. The rest of the galaxy, with its pristine worlds and technologically superior civilizations, considered Deathworlders little more than an anomaly, a curious fact to file away. But Commander Carl never bought into that sentiment. Something about Deathworlders always felt off to him. And now, here he was, leading an entire fleet into a backwater sector where humans had been spotted. An insignificant mission, they said. Routine, they claimed. The arrogance of it all made Carl grind his teeth. "Commander, we're approaching the human territory," an ensign reported, a smug tone lacing his words as if they were about to sweat an insect. Carl tapped his claws against the control panel, staring at the approaching human zone. It was quiet, too quiet. They had intercepted a distress signal from a nearby colony, presumably under attack. Humans, they assumed. Deathworlders, they knew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. "Send a message to the colony. Inform them we're moving in to assess the situation. Prepare the fleet," Carl commanded, his eyes narrowing as he studied the darkness ahead. It was a standard procedure for a Zygrexian fleet, fast, efficient, and overwhelming. The Deathworlders couldn't possibly resist. The message was sent, and the fleet's formation shifted effortlessly into an attack-ready stance. But there was no response. No signs of life from the colony. No reply from the humans. Just silence. Carl's unease grew. "Still no response from the colony or the Deathworlders, Commander." The ensign's voice broke through the silence. "Prepare to launch a recon team," Carl ordered. "I want eyes on that colony. Something isn't right." As the recon team moved into position, the first signs of life appeared on the scanners. A single human vessel, small, seemingly outdated, hanging in the void like a forgotten relic. Carl's crew laughed. This was the legendary threat of the Deathworlders. A single, battered ship against the might of the Zygrexian Empire? Ridiculous. "Shall we engage, Commander?" one of the officers asked, barely suppressing his amusement. Carl hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming at him to wait, but logic told him otherwise. "Engage. Take it down. Let's end this before it begins." The officer grinned and issued the order. The fleet surged forward, weapons primed, prepared to obliterate the lone human ship in one swift strike. But just as they were about to fire, a voice crackled through the comms. Human, calm, and unnervingly steady. "Leave now, or suffer the consequences." The command deck fell silent for a moment. Carl blinked, staring at the transmission as though it were a trick of the mind. A single human was threatening them? He had half a mind to respond, but before he could, his second-in-command sneered. "Typical Deathworlder bravado. Ignore it. They've got nothing." Carl nodded slowly, though his claws continued to tap the console. "Proceed." The fleet opened fire. Blinding beams of energy lanced toward the human vessel, and for a split second, it seemed as though the battle would end before it even began. But the human ship moved, fast. Faster than any of them expected. It weaved through the barrage with impossible precision, the shots missing by mere inches. "How?" the officer gasped, his confidence faltering. "Status of the human ship?" Carl barked, leaning forward. "Still operational, Commander. Minimal damage," came the shaken response. Carl's stomach twisted. Deathworlders were supposed to be primitive, unrefined, mere brutes compared to the elegance of Zygrexian technology. Yet here was this human ship, defying every expectation, dodging fire like it was nothing. He watched as the human vessel began to return fire, not a scattershot of random bursts, but precise, calculated strikes. One Zygrexian cruiser exploded in a shower of debris. Another was critically damaged. The rest of the fleet scrambled, trying to adjust to the humans' erratic but effective tactics. "They're picking us apart," one of the ensigns stammered, disbelief written all over his face. Carl's claws dug into the armrests of his seat. "Fall back! Regroup, now!" His voice cut through the panic rising on the command deck. But as the order went out, the human ship vanished into the void, disappearing from their sensors as though it had never been there. "What are they doing?" Carl muttered under his breath. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. They had come here expecting a routine mission, a show of force to cow the primitives into submission. Yet the Deathworlders had outmaneuvered them with ease. "Deathworlders!" Carl growled, the word now carrying a weight it hadn't before. He couldn't deny it any longer. This wasn't going to be easy. His crew looked to him for answers, their earlier arrogance replaced by uncertainty. But Carl had none. For the first time in years, the seasoned commander found himself unsure of what to do next. "Commander, they've disappeared from our sensors," the ensign reported, disbelief clear in his voice. Carl gritted his teeth. How had a single Deathworlder ship outmaneuvered an entire Zagrexian fleet? It wasn't just skill, it was something else, something that shouldn't have been possible. "Keep scanning," Carl snapped, rising from his seat, his claws digging into the metal console. "They're hiding, but they can't stay hidden forever." The crew scrambled to follow his orders, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. They had faced countless enemies before, but this was different. Humans weren't supposed to be a threat. They were the ones who should be running scared. Yet here they were, making fools of an elite Zagrexian fleet. "Commander, incoming transmission," the comms officer said, his voice wavering. Carl narrowed his eyes. "Put it through." The voice that came through was calm, too calm. It was the human captain again, and there was no fear in his tone, just a quiet, unnerving confidence. "You should have left when you had the chance," the human said simply. "Now you're in our territory." Carl's claws tapped against the console rhythmically, his mind racing. "Your territory?" He leaned forward, speaking into the comms. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, Deathworlder. This is your final warning. Surrender, and we'll spare what's left of your fleet." There was a brief silence before the human chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver through the command deck. "Outnumbered, sure," the human replied, his voice almost mocking. "Outgunned? That's what you don't understand, Commander. We don't need bigger guns. We know how to use what we have." Carl's eyes flicked to the tactical display. His fleet was in disarray, trying to reorganize after the initial attack. It should have been a slaughter, yet the human had crippled multiple ships with surgical precision, like they were toying with them. "Don't be a fool, Deathworlder. You've pushed your luck far enough," Carl growled, his patience wearing thin. Another chuckle. "Luck? No. It's not luck. It's survival. Something you clearly don't understand." Before Carl could respond, alarms blared across the command deck. The human ship had reappeared, directly behind one of his destroyers. Before the crew could react, the human vessel fired a single shot, hitting a critical point in the destroyer's hull. The massive ship erupted into flames, its wreckage scattering through the void. "How did they?" one of the officers muttered, his voice trembling with shock. "Stealth technology," Carl hissed. "They're hiding their movements, waiting for us to make mistakes." But that wasn't the worst of it. The humans weren't just hiding. They were watching, learning. Every move the Zagrexians made was being countered as if the humans could predict their every thought. "Commander, they've disabled another cruiser!" the ensign shouted, panic now creeping into his voice. Carl's fury boiled over. "How are they doing this?" He slammed his fist into the console, sending a ripple of fear through the crew. But in the back of his mind, the commander already knew the answer. The humans were fighting like animals backed into a corner, but with a calculated brutality that no other species could match. They didn't rely on superior technology or overwhelming firepower. They relied on instinct, on survival. It was something the Zagrexians, for all their advancements, couldn't replicate. "Commander, we've lost 3 more ships," an officer reported, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many of them are there?" Carl demanded, his mind reeling from the losses. "Just the one ship, sir," the officer replied, his face pale. Carl's stomach dropped. One ship. One Deathworlder ship had done all of this. It defied every law of warfare, every tactic he'd ever learned. And yet, here they were, being picked apart like prey. He leaned back in his chair, his claws still tapping against the console. "Prepare the fleet for a full assault," he ordered quietly. "I don't care what it takes. We're taking them down." The crew moved into action, but Carl could see the doubt in their eyes. They were scared. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled him. Zagrexians didn't get scared. They were the hunters, not the hunted. "Commander, they're hailing us again," the comms officer said, his voice barely steady. "Patch them through," Carl growled. The human captain's voice filled the command deck once more, calm and infuriatingly assured. "I told you to leave, Commander," the human said. "You should have listened. Now it's too late." Carl clenched his jaw. "You think one ship can defeat an entire fleet? You may have had the element of surprise, Deathworlder, but that won't last." "Surprise?" The human chuckled again. "This isn't about surprise, Commander. This is about survival. And if there's one thing we Deathworlders know, it's how to survive." Before Carl could respond, the human ship launched another attack. But this time, it wasn't just a hit and run. The humans were going for the throat. They targeted the Zagrexian flagship, hitting vital systems with pinpoint accuracy. The bridge shook violently as explosions rocked the ship. "Shields failing!" one of the officers screamed. Carl gripped the armrests of his chair, his mind racing. How could this be happening? How had they miscalculated so badly? "Commander, we need to retreat," an officer pleaded. Carl's claws dug into the metal. Retreat. From a single Deathworlder ship. The thought was unbearable, yet the reality was undeniable. "Fall back," Carl ordered through gritted teeth. "Regroup. We'll crush them in the next wave." But as the order went out, the human ship didn't pursue. Instead, they sent one final message. "We let you live this time, Commander," the human captain said. "Next time, you won't be so lucky." The transmission ended, and the human ship vanished once again into the void, leaving the battered Zagrexian fleet in its wake. For the first time in his long career, Carl felt a cold shiver of fear. Deathworlders weren't just dangerous. They were something far worse. And now, the entire galaxy would know why. "Commander, they're regrouping." The voice trembled, though the ensign tried to maintain composure. The Zagrexian fleet, battered and disorganized, attempted to fall back into a defensive formation. But no matter how many times Carl ordered them to regroup, it felt as if they were always one step behind. And the humans were relentless. "Focus on the flagship," Carl barked. His frustration had morphed into a cold fury, every move the humans made chipping away at his confidence. How had it come to this? How had they let one Deathworlder ship turn the might of the Zagrexian fleet into a chaotic mess? The tactical display flickered, showing the positions of the remaining ships. Each time the Zagrexians moved, the human ship was there, disrupting their coordination with surgical precision. It wasn't brute strength, it was strategy, adaptability, something Carl had never seen in such a small force before. "They're reading our movements," Carl muttered, his eyes locked on the display. "They're watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike." His claws scraped against the armrests, his mind racing. What was the human captain thinking? What was their endgame? This wasn't a typical battle, it was a lesson in humiliation. "Commander, their ship has just disabled another destroyer." The officer's voice snapped him back to reality. Carl snarled. "They're toying with us. Commander, we need to counter their strategy." An officer began, but Carl cut him off. "I know that," he roared, his frustration boiling over. "You think I don't see what's happening? They're drawing us in, making us react, while they sit back and strike at their leisure." He stood abruptly, pacing the command deck as the crew looked on, unsure of what to say. The Zagrexian forces were in complete disarray. Morale was slipping. Fear was creeping in. Carl could see it in their eyes, the uncertainty, the doubt. These were not emotions Zagrexians were supposed to feel, especially not in battle. Prepare the fleet for an offensive, Carl ordered, his voice low but firm. We'll overwhelm them with sheer force. The officers moved quickly to execute the command, but deep down, Carl knew it wasn't going to be enough. The humans weren't fighting by the usual rules of engagement. They weren't following any predictable patterns. And that terrified him. Commander, the human ship is advancing, the comms officer announced, his voice trembling. It's moving directly toward us. Carl's eyes narrowed. So, they were coming for the flagship. The arrogance of it. Did they truly believe they could destroy the command ship? Or was this another one of their tricks? Focus all fire on that ship, Carl barked. We'll end this now. The Zagrexian fleet moved as one, all guns aimed at the advancing human vessel. But once again, the Deathworlders surprised them. Instead of continuing its direct approach, the human ship suddenly veered off, using a nearby asteroid field as cover. The Zagrexian guns fired into the void, missing their target entirely. They're baiting us again, Carl growled, his fists clenching. They're making fools of us. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of every decision bearing down on him. The Zagrexians had never been humiliated like this, never been outmaneuvered by such a small force. And yet here they were, on the verge of collapse. Commander, they've disabled our secondary engines! An officer cried out, panic rising in his voice. We're losing maneuverability. Carl slammed his fist against the console, his frustration boiling over. How were they doing this? How could one ship, one human ship, cause so much damage? They're not just hitting us with brute force, Carl muttered under his breath. They're thinking ahead, anticipating our moves. He paced the command deck, his mind racing. The humans were exploiting every weakness, every mistake. They were outnumbered, but they fought like they had nothing to lose. And that made them dangerous. They know we're afraid, Carl realized, his voice barely a whisper. They can see it. And they're using it against us. The crew exchanged nervous glances. No one wanted to admit it, but it was true. Fear had begun to spread through the ranks, and the humans could sense it. They were pushing the Zagrexians to the edge, waiting for them to break. Commander, they're hailing us again, the comms officer said, his voice tense. Carl's claws dug into the armrests as he sat back down, his fury barely contained. Put them through. The human captain's voice filled the command deck, calm and controlled. You're losing, Commander. You know it, and your crew knows it. But you don't have to die today. Surrender, and we'll let you live. The words hit Carl like a punch to the gut. Surrender? The very idea was unthinkable. Zagrexians didn't surrender. They fought until the end, no matter the cost. But as he looked around the command deck, at the faces of his crew, he saw the doubt in their eyes. The fear. The uncertainty. You think I'll surrender to you, Deathworlder? Carl spat, his voice dripping with venom. You're nothing. A speck of dust in the galaxy. The human captain chuckled softly. Maybe. But right now, that speck of dust is about to destroy your entire fleet. The transmission ended, and the human ship vanished from the sensors once more. Carl's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the tactical display, watching as the Zagrexian ships struggled to maintain formation. They're playing with us, Carl muttered, his voice low and full of anger. But they're right. We're losing. It was a bitter realization, one that cut deep. Carl had never lost a battle before. He had always been the one in control, the one leading the charge. But now, the humans had turned the tables. They had made the Zagrexians look weak, helpless. Commander, what are your orders? An officer asked, his voice barely steady. Carl's mind raced. Every instinct told him to keep fighting, to push forward and destroy the human ship. But logic told him otherwise. The humans had outsmarted them at every turn, and continuing the fight would only lead to more losses. Prepare for a tactical retreat, Carl ordered, his voice quiet but firm. We'll regroup and launch a counterattack when we're ready. The officers moved quickly to execute the command, but the tension in the air was palpable. The Zagrexians had never been forced to retreat before, especially not from a single ship. It was a humiliation that would haunt them for years to come. As the fleet began to pull back, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The humans had proven themselves to be far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. They were resourceful, relentless, and utterly unpredictable. Deathworlders, Carl muttered under his breath. They're not like the others. They don't fight by the rules. They don't care about honor or tradition. They only care about survival. And in that moment, Carl realized why the galaxy should fear them. The Deathworlders didn't need superior technology or massive fleets. They had something far more dangerous, an unbreakable will to survive, no matter the cost. The Zagrexian fleet was barely holding together. Fires raged across several ships, and the remnants of their once proud armada were scattered, limping back to form some semblance of a defense. Carl stood on the command deck, his fury replaced by a cold, grim realization. They had lost control. The human ship was out there, watching. Waiting. They hadn't fired for several minutes, but that didn't mean the threat had passed. No, the humans were just deciding when to strike next. They were in complete control now, and Carl knew it. "Commander, we've got them surrounded. We can still push forward," an officer suggested, though his voice lacked any real conviction. Carl shook his head slowly. "No," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've already won." It was a bitter admission, but the truth was undeniable. The humans had outsmarted them at every turn. They had turned the Zagrexian fleet into a disorganized mess, and now they were tightening the noose. The realization sank in like a weight in Carl's chest. The Zagrexians, once the most feared species in the galaxy, had been outmaneuvered by a single human ship. "Commander, they're on the move again," the tactical officer called out, his voice tight with fear. Carl turned to the display. The human vessel was indeed moving, cutting through the darkness like a predator stalking its prey. But this time, it wasn't aiming for the smaller ships. No, it was heading straight for the flagship. "All weapons, fire at will!" Carl shouted, his voice commanding. Even if this was their end, he wasn't going to let the Deathworlders take them without a fight. The remaining Zagrexian ships fired everything they had, beams of energy and explosive rounds filling the void between them and the approaching human vessel. But just like before, the human ship weaved effortlessly through the barrage, its movements precise and calculated. It was like watching a predator toy with its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. "They're going to hit us directly," the tactical officer stammered, his face pale. Carl's heart raced. He knew what was coming, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. The human ship was already too close, too fast. They had planned this from the beginning, luring the Zagrexians into a trap that they had been too arrogant to see. "Brace for impact!" Carl shouted, gripping the armrests of his chair as the human ship closed in. But instead of a direct hit, the human vessel unleashed a concentrated energy pulse, not aimed at the hull, but at the flagship's critical systems. The lights on the command deck flickered, and the ship shuddered violently as the power grid overloaded. Consoles sparked and exploded, and several crew members were thrown to the floor as the ship's systems began to fail one by one. "They've disabled our primary systems!" one of the officers cried, panic setting in. Carl's claws dug into the armrests. "They're not trying to destroy us," he muttered. "They're disabling us. They want us to watch." The human ship didn't fire again. It simply hovered there, as if daring the Zagrexians to make another move. But there was nothing they could do. The flagship was dead in the water, its weapons and engines offline. They were helpless. "Commander, we have to surrender," one of the officers said, his voice trembling. "If we don't—" "Silence!" Carl snapped. "We don't surrender. Not to them." But even as he spoke, Carl knew it was over. The humans had won. They had proven themselves to be more than just primitive Deathworlders. They were predators capable of outthinking and outmaneuvering even the most advanced species in the galaxy. And now, the Zagrexians would have to live with the shame of having been bested by them. "Incoming transmission," the comms officer announced, his voice hollow. Carl didn't even need to ask who it was. The human captain's voice filled the command deck once again, calm and cold. "This is your last chance, Commander," the human said. "Surrender, and we'll let you live. Resist, and we'll finish what we started." Carl stared at the tactical display, his mind racing. He had never surrendered before. No Zygrexian had. But as he looked around the command deck, at the faces of his crew, his warriors, he saw the truth in their eyes. They couldn't win this. "Not today, Commander," the tactical officer began, but Carl raised a hand to silence him. He took a deep breath, his claws retracting as he slowly stood. "Open the channel," he ordered quietly. The human captain appeared on the screen, his expression unreadable. For a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of the moment pressing down on the entire command deck. "You fought well, Deathworlder," Carl said, his voice thick with bitterness. "But don't think for a second that this is over." The human captain's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I never do. But today you walk away. Next time, who knows?" Carl's jaw tightened, but he gave a sharp nod. "We'll retreat. But remember this, the Zygrexians don't forget." The human's eyes narrowed. "Neither do we." With that, the transmission ended, and the human ship disappeared from the sensors, vanishing into the darkness of space once again. For a long moment, there was silence on the command deck. The crew, still processing what had just happened, exchanged uneasy glances. They had survived, but the cost to their pride and reputation was immeasurable. "Prepare the fleet for retreat," Carl ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. As the Zygrexian ships slowly turned and began their journey back to their homeworld, Carl stared out into the void, his mind racing. The Deathworlders had shown them something today, something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just their technology or their tactics that made them a threat. It was their will. Their refusal to back down, no matter the odds. The Zygrexians had always believed themselves to be the apex predators of the galaxy. But now, Carl wasn't so sure. "Deathworlders," he muttered under his breath, his claws tapping rhythmically against the console. "The galaxy will never be the same again." And as the Zygrexian fleet limped home, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The humans had made their mark, and now the entire galaxy would have to reckon with the reality of what it meant to face a Deathworlder.